In the first part of this video series, we looked at sculpting up all of the individual pieces for a female android. In this second part of the series, we're going to have an epic moulding and casting session, and then I'm going to start putting all of the individual cast pieces together with some brass and aluminium fixtures. So now that I have all of the individual parts of the sculpture constructed, I can now start making moulds of each piece. This is going to involve a few different types of moulds. In the case of the head here, what I need to do is actually make a two-piece mould. So what I'm doing is building a frame around it. I can then use some water-based clay to create a divide which will separate the two halves of the mould. The torso is going to be a little bit different to the head because it's quite a large object and I want to put some mechanisms inside. I'm going to actually make it hollow. So I'm going to make a mould that I can pour some rotocasting resin in. I can then slush the resin around on the inside to create a hollow cast. In order to do that, I'm going to build an enclosure out of foam board around the sculpture which will contain the silicon. Now it's not too pretty, but I think it's going to do the job. So that's not looking too bad. As you can see, there's quite a large aperture at the front of the mould here, so that's going to allow me to see what I'm doing as I rotate the rotocasting resin around on the interior of the mould. So I can now move on and start making a mould for the pelvis. In this case, what I'm going to do is a similar method, but because I'm going to have quite a lot of dead space, I'm going to chop up some old moulds and use those as ballast, so I don't use quite as much silicon as I otherwise might. Because I have all these small individual pieces in here, there's a good chance that air will get trapped, so what I'm going to do is to put this mould into the vacuum chamber and evacuate the air. Now that I've pulled all the air out, you can see that the level of the silicon has dropped quite a lot. So I'm going to continue with the same method, put some additional cut up pieces of old moulds in there, and then top it up with some more silicon. So that takes care of the two main shapes of the body. I can now make the moulds for the limbs, and these are going to be very simple one-piece paw moulds. So there are all my various types of moulds ready for casting. Now that I've got those in place, I can now start casting up all of the individual pieces for the model. At the time I was doing this, it was actually quite cold in the UK, so I've actually brought all of my casting materials into the house rather than using the workshop at the end of the garden. The temperature does have an effect on the cure time of the resin, so it's much easier to do in a warm environment. The head's not looking too bad there, so I can now turn my attention to doing the torso. Now this is slightly different to the head, because what I'm going to do is pour in some rotocasting resin and rotate the mould, and the resin will stick to the outside of the mould and cure, leaving me with a hollow cast. I'm using quite a quick set resin here, so this is done in about 5 minutes. I'm rather pleased with that. That looks really, really good. Very minor air bubbles here and there, but that's come out really, really well. So with that done, I can now turn my attention to casting up the other pieces of the model. This is mostly the limbs, so these are much simpler moulds than the pieces I've done so far. Those are all looking pretty good. So the last piece to do now is the pelvis. At the time of doing this, the weather had actually improved, so the temperature in the workshop wasn't too bad, so I've moved back outside again to do this piece. Same as the torso, this is going to be a rotocast piece, so I'm pouring in some rotocasting resin and rotating the mould around to get the final piece. So now that I've got all of my individual pieces cast up, it's now time to start putting them together. So my plan for this is to include a bunch of mechanical detailing using aluminium and brass pieces. I want to include some pistons and various other mechanical parts to really show the interior of the robot. So I think that looks quite nice. So what I now need to do is cut out some spaces for the legs to attach. Okay, I think I actually need to take this outside. This is getting a little bit messy. So as I mentioned, this casting is hollow, but I need to actually cut out some apertures in it, in the spaces where the legs will attach. So I need to make a spine. And what I've got are these tubes, brass and aluminium, of different sizes. So what I'm thinking is I can cut these down and make some segments for a spine. Now, in order to put these spines together, what I'm doing is cutting these tubes to size. I'm also cutting some detailing into the brass tube, so it's not just a flat finish. I'm using the lathe to cut some acetal spacers that will fit inside the segments of brass tube. I'm also going to use a length of this aluminium. This is actually quite bendy, it's used for sculptures, but what I'm thinking is if I include this, it means that I can actually bend the spine to whatever shape I need. So if I need to repose the figure, that's actually possible. So I'm going to use that as the backbone for my spine, if you will, and that should allow me to repose the figure however I need to. I need to add a ton more mechanical detailing, but I think that's looking really good as a first pass. I also have these ball joints, and I think these are actually intended to be used as feet for lighting. You seem to be able to get them from lighting supply shops. I got them from eBay. So I think they're going to be quite useful as a ball joint for my legs. Now what these are screwed into is actually some hollow M10 threaded tube. Now that's typically seems to be used for lighting as well, but I think this is going to be really useful because I can actually feed some cables through it, which will allow me to feed power into the robot and add some lighting effects. For the shoulders I also have these additional ball joints, and I have these pieces from hard drives which I'm going to include as well. I quite like the look of the silver brackets with the brass ball joint. I think that looks quite nice. So I'm going to drill a hole through the torso, put some threaded rod through and attach the ball joints to that. Now I mentioned that I wanted to include some articulation with some servos, so all I'm doing is cutting out some shapes in acetal. What I can do is put a bearing into one of these, and then drive a piece of dowel through the centre, and that will give me a bracket that I can put into the torso of the robot, and that will allow the torso to move quite freely. What I've also done is to cut down some brass rod to serve as knee joints, and I've lathed in some detail at the end so it looks like a bearing joint. For the thigh, one thing that I wanted to have from the very beginning was to have an indented piece of brass So what I'm doing here is using one of these step drills to cut in a 20mm hole into the resin. Now this is one of the advantages of actually casting these pieces up in solid resin. If I tried to do this on my master, because it was comprised of Sculpey, plastic and foil, I wouldn't have been able to drill a hole directly through it. It probably would have fallen apart. But because this is one consistent material, I'm able to drill a hole through it quite easily. What I've done is to lathe down some additional brass pieces. So the idea being that these would actually attach to the ball joints that I've attached to the waist, and that will act as a pivot point. Something I also need to do is start adding some detail to the cast resin pieces. I ended up holding off adding detail to the masters because I figured I could actually start gluing detail onto the cast pieces once I had them cast up. The cool thing about this type of resin is you can cut into it very easily, and you can glue to it very easily, and you can sand it, so it's quite malleable in that sense. It's also quite strong. So what I've done here is to actually cut in some panel detail and drill some holes. I've done this using a method that I've used in previous mech builds that you may have seen. What I've done is to file down an X-Acto knife or a scalpel to a dull point, and then I'm then using a guide to scratch in panel detail into the resin. And as you can see, I've cut in a variety of panel detailing here, and I've also drilled some holes, glued in some, what these actually are the heads of pins. I've just cut the stem off, glued those in, and they look quite nice as rivets. So now I can use the same method to cut in additional detail across all of the cast pieces that I've made. The piston on the back of the leg here is something that I've used in a previous mech build, and what these are shock dampeners from remote control cars. Now these things look really cool, there's lots of detail in here, and I think that's going to look really nice on the back of the leg. I was worrying that the legs of this piece might look a little bit spindly, so I think adding additional detail like this onto the sculpture really helps with that. So I'm going to leave it here for this part of the video. There's still plenty to do, so there'll be at least one additional part of this video series, maybe even two. Anyway, that's it for this part of the video series, so if you've made it this far, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.